A single dad delivers homemade soup to his sick neighbor unaware. She's a secret millionaire who's been quietly watching his every act of kindness from behind her curtains. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The morning began like most others, with the faint whistle of the kettle and the scent of coffee drifting through the modest kitchen. Jake Wallace rubbed sleep from his eyes, reaching across the counter for two mismatched mugs sewn chipped, the other bearing the faded logo of a diner that had closed years ago. The floor creaked under his bare feet as he moved with practiced rhythm, pouring himself a cup before preparing cocoa for Tyler, who was still burrowed under a mountain of blankets in the next room. Outside, the sidewalks were slick with frost, glinting in the early light like tiny shards of glass. The old house groaned against the chill, but inside, warmth lived in the clutter, the casserole dishes stacked on the table, the school papers pinned crookedly to the fridge, the scent of cinnamon that clung to the air long after the last apple pie had cooled. Jake leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee as he scanned the worn notebook where he scribbled recipes and grocery lists in the same looping handwriting. "Dad," came a sleepy voice from the hallway. Tyler stood in his dinosaur pajamas, one sock missing, hair sticking up in all directions. He rubbed one eye and yawned. "You made the cocoa too hot again." Jake chuckled. "You say that every morning." Tyler climbed onto a stool at the counter, inspecting the mug like a tiny food critic. "Well, every morning, it's too hot." Jake made a show of blowing on it dramatically. "There, 5-star service." They ate quietly, Jake with toast, Tyler with cold cereal, until the silence was broken by a thunk against the window. A crow had landed on the sill, peering in as if waiting for crumbs. "You think it's the same one from yesterday?" Tyler asked. "Maybe he's checking on us," Jake said with a smile, "making sure we're still okay." Outside, the town was beginning to stir. Plumes of smoke rose from chimneys. A delivery truck rumbled past. And Jake, still in his faded hoodie and slippers, made a mental note to start prepping the day's catering orders before noon. The kitchen was his world, part business, part lifeline. But as he washed their dishes in warm, soapy water, he felt something he couldn't name. Like change was close, standing just outside, waiting for its chance to knock. It wasn't the kind of thing most people would notice. Just a porch light, quietly burning through the night and into the next day. But Jake noticed. He always did. Every morning as he shuffled down the front steps with Tyler's backpack in one hand and a to-go coffee thermos in the other, he passed the old Victorian next door. It had been Miss Evans' house for nearly a year now, ever since the for sale sign vanished from the lawn and the moving truck had pulled in late one rainy afternoon. Since then, she'd lived like a whisper, shades drawn, lights low, never joining the neighborhood potlucks or lingering on the sidewalk like most folks did when the weather was nice. Jake didn't mind. Some people liked their quiet. He understood that better than most. But this week, something was off. The porch light had been on for 3 nights straight, glowing stubbornly through fog, rain, and the early autumn chill. The front steps, usually brushed clean, had gathered a scatter of damp leaves. The mailbox hadn't been emptied. No deliveries, no visitors, no flicker of movement through the curtains. "Dad, do you think she's okay?" Tyler asked that morning as they stood by the car, both of them looking at the house next door. Jake followed his son's gaze. The light buzzed faintly in the misty morning air, casting a yellow halo over the steps. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe she just forgot to turn it off." "She never forgets," Tyler said, his voice low. "Remember when you left the trash can out too long and she brought it to the side of the house without even saying anything?" Jake smirked. "She's got eyes like a hawk, that's for sure." Still, something in him stirred a tug of worry, quiet but persistent. He told himself it was nothing. People get busy. They keep to themselves. Not everyone likes to chat over fences or wave from porches. But as he watched the flickering light from his kitchen window that evening, Jake couldn't shake the feeling. The house looked the same as always, neat, still, untouched. But suddenly, it didn't feel like silence. It felt like absence. and Jake, who knew what absence could become, found himself watching that porch light like it might blink out and leave nothing behind. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees and the sky turned that soft lavender shade only October could paint, Jake had made up his mind. It wasn't dramatic, the way concern worked on him. It was quiet, a slow settling in his chest, like dust on a windowsill. He couldn't stop thinking about that porch light still on, the mailbox still full, and the house next door, which now seemed less like a quiet home and more like a sealed box, holding something inside that didn't feel right. Tyler was curled up on the couch, watching a cartoon and munching on crackers when Jake tied on his apron and pulled a pot from the cabinet. He didn't bother with a recipe. He didn't need one. Chicken soup was muscle memory by now chopped onions, a few carrots, leftover rotisserie, and a handful of egg noodles. The kind of meal that didn't try too hard, just warm and honest. As the broth simmered and filled the house with that comforting, savory scent, Jake scrawled a note on the back of a grocery receipt. "Hi there, thought you might be under the weather." Left some soup, no strings, no expectations. Just neighbor stuff. He folded it, stuck it in a clean envelope, and set it beside the Tupperware container now filled with steaming soup. After a moment's thought, he added a small paper napkin with a hand-drawn smiley face Tyler had doodled earlier. It wasn't much, but it felt right. The evening air was crisp when Jake stepped onto the porch. Leaves whispered under his boots as he crossed over to her steps. He placed the soup carefully by the door, tucked the note beside it, and knocked gently just once. Not loud. Just enough to let her know someone had been there. Then he turned and walked away. No answer. No movement behind the curtains. The porch light buzzed on. Back inside, Jake didn't say much. He just sat at the kitchen table, sipping the last of his coffee, while Tyler dozed on the couch, the soup pot still warm on the stove behind him. He didn't know if she'd eat it. Didn't know if she'd even open the door. But still, something felt lighter. Sometimes, silence wasn't emptiness. Sometimes, it was a beginning. Catherine stood still, barely breathing, the fabric of the sheer curtain cool between her fingertips as she peered through it at the fading evening. He was walking away now, Jake Wallace, the neighbor, with tired eyes and steady hands. The man she'd watched from this very window more times than she cared to admit. He moved with purpose, even in the smallest acts, like setting down the container of soup on her porch. Not rushed, not showy. Just intentional. She hadn't expected him to knock. The truth was, she hadn't expected anyone to notice. She'd spent months perfecting the art of being invisible in this town quiet. Comings and goings, groceries delivered, shades drawn, conversations politely deflected. The fewer the interactions, the lower the risk. That was the plan. That was safe. But then came the soup. The aroma had reached her through the cracks of the old door even before she'd touched the knob. Warm, nostalgic, absurdly kind. And the note, simple words scribbled on the back of a receipt, no flourish, no pressure, just neighbor stuff. She'd read it twice, then again. It felt like someone offering a hand across a chasm, even if they didn't realize how far down she'd been standing. She watched Jake step across the yard, the porch light still painting him in a golden hue. His shoulders sloped a little as he walked, the kind of tired that comes from carrying more than just the day. Inside his house, she could see faint movement, this sun, no doubt, small and bright like a candle through the window. Her chest tightened. It had been years since someone cooked for her. Even longer since she'd let anyone see her without a calculated purpose. She wasn't just Catherine Evans, the woman in the house next door. She was Catherine Whitmore, the same Catherine who'd walked away from boardrooms, headlines, and half a dozen empty friendships. And yet, here she was, clutching a curtain like a girl at the edge of something unknown. The soup sat by the door. She hadn't moved to take it. Not yet. But she stayed at the window, watching the man who had left it behind and wondering, for the first time in a long while, what it might feel like to be seen. The morning air was sharp, crisp enough to bite through Jake's sweatshirt as he stepped onto the porch with his usual cup of coffee. The sky was pale, still shaking off the fog of dawn, and the street was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves tumbling along the sidewalk. He hadn't thought much about the soup since leaving it on Miss Evans' porch. In truth, he hadn't expected anything to come of it. Maybe she'd take it in. Maybe not. People handled kindness differently. Some welcomed it, some ran from it. But now, as he stepped down the creaky stairs and turned to glance toward her house, he stopped. The container he'd left was back. Sitting neatly on his porch railing, lid wiped clean, and resting on top of it was a single folded card, the kind with weight to it, the kind you didn't buy in a hurry. Jake blinked, surprised. He hadn't heard anyone in the night, hadn't seen the porch light flash on. Balancing his coffee on the railing, he opened the card. The handwriting was elegant, the kind that spoke of careful schooling and expensive pens. It read, "Thank you. You cook with more care than most people live with. C. E. Jake." Read it again, then once more, slower this time. The words weren't overly sentimental, but something about them stuck. There was no mention of her being sick, no awkward gratitude. Just that line, more care than most people live with, and his initials at the bottom like a signature on something meaningful. He smiled softly, folding the note with a kind of reverence before slipping it into his back pocket. The container, clean and warm from the early sun, was a small thing. But to Jake, it felt like the closing of one door and the gentle creak of another swinging open. From the sidewalk, he cast a quick glance toward her house, curtains still drawn. Porch light off, for the first time in days. "Morning, Miss Evans," he murmured, voice low and just for the air. "Glad you're still with us." He picked up the container and headed back inside, already wondering what he might make next time. Not out of obligation, just neighbor stuff. Just because. The living room was a cozy mess of blankets, cereal bowls, and the faint sound of Saturday morning cartoons humming from the old TV in the corner. Jake was at the kitchen counter, whisking pancake batter, while Tyler sat at the table, legs swinging, crayons scattered around him like tiny splashes of color. "Dad," Tyler said, not looking up from his drawing, "why don't we ever see the lady next door?" Jake paused mid-whisk, batter dripping slowly back into the bowl. "Miss Evans?" he asked. Tyler nodded, still focused on shading and what looked like a very enthusiastic dinosaur. "She's just private, I guess," Jake said carefully. "Some people like to keep to themselves." "Like a spy?" Tyler's eyes lit up. "You think she's a spy?" Jake chuckled. "Pretty sure spies don't live in old Victorian houses and leave thank you notes for chicken soup." "But she is kind of invisible," Tyler continued. "She never comes outside, never talks to anyone, and when she does, it's only to you." Jake scraped the batter into the hot skillet, the sizzle filling the quiet between them. "That's not true," he said, though even as he said it, he realized Tyler wasn't wrong. "I think she's lonely," Tyler said suddenly, his voice softer now. Jake glanced over, surprised. Tyler was staring out the window toward Miss Evans' house, where the curtains still hung like secrets and the porch looked untouched by time. "Why do you say that?" Jake asked. Tyler shrugged. "I don't know. She looked sad the day she brought the soup container back. I saw her from my window. She didn't smile or anything. She just stood there." Jake let the moment settle. He flipped a pancake, heart tugged in two directions, one part practical, one part curious. Kids saw things adults missed, and Tyler, for all his silliness, had a way of noticing what mattered. "She's probably been through something," Jake said finally. "Same way we have. Everyone carries stuff you can't always see." Tyler nodded, like he understood more than he let on, then picked up his blue crayon and got back to his drawing. "Maybe we should make her cookies next time." Jake smiled, watching his son color with all the certainty in the world. "Maybe we should." The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't quite made up their mind. Jake stood in his kitchen, humming under his breath as he scooped mashed potatoes into a neatly sealed container. Alongside it went slices of roast chicken and sautéed green beans with garlic, simple, hearty, warm, not fancy, but real. He packed it with the same care he gave to every plate he ever served, smoothing the foil and double-checking the seal. It wasn't just a meal. Not anymore. Tyler had insisted they add something sweet, so a small plastic bag of homemade snickerdoodles sat on top, tied with a blue ribbon that had once been wrapped around a birthday gift. Jake paused, scribbling a short note on a sticky pad. "Thought you might be hungry again. No expectations, just neighbor stuff." He stuck it to the lid, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the cool, damp air. Catherine's porch was quiet, as always, the same ivy curling around the post. The same wooden steps that creaked just slightly under his weight. He crouched, set the food gently on the doormat, and exhaled. Just as he turned to leave, the door creaked open behind him. He froze. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind nudging the trees. Then he turned slowly, finding her there. Catherine Evans, standing in the doorway, one hand still clutching the handle, the other gripping the frame like she needed its weight to stay grounded. She looked different in the daylight. Softer, not polished, not hidden behind curtains and shadows. Her hair was tied up in a loose twist, a few strands falling around her face, and her eyes, those pale, searching eye-shelled, something raw. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said, her voice gentle, almost uncertain. Jake offered a quiet smile. "I know." She looked down at the container, then back up. "But thank you. It smells like Sundays." Jake's smile deepened. "Then I must have done something right." For a heartbeat they stood in that space, half porch, half possibility, before Catherine gave a tiny nod and stepped back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. But this time, the porch light didn't come on. The next day came draped in soft gray clouds and the scent of impending rain. Jake had just finished unloading a box of supplies from the back of his van when he noticed movement across the yard's light, careful, like a bird unsure of where to land. Catherine was standing on her porch again. This time, she wasn't half hidden behind a door or peeking through curtains. She was out in the open, arms crossed over a cream-colored cardigan, eyes fixed on him with an expression he couldn't quite name, part curiosity, part hesitation. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and gave her a wave, casual, as if it were any other neighborly moment. To his quiet surprise, she stepped down from her porch. Only 2 steps. But still. "I wanted to return these," she said, holding out the Tupperware containers he'd brought her meals in. Her voice was soft, a little scratchy around the edges, like she wasn't used to using it. Jake walked over and accepted the containers with a small smile. "You didn't have to. I figured I'd just cycle through them." Catherine gave a breath of a laugh, not quite amused, but not closed off either. "I don't like loose ends." He nodded. "Fair enough." A pause stretched between them, long enough for the wind to shift and carry the faint scent of earth and distant chimney smoke. Catherine looked past him toward his porch, where Tyler's sneakers were lying sideways like he'd kicked them off in midair. "Your son," she said slowly. "He's a bright kid." Jake's brow lifted slightly. "You've seen him." "I've seen you both," she admitted, eyes flicking back to his. "You take care of things, even when no one's watching." Jake studied her, something stirring in his chest that wasn't quite pride, wasn't quite vulnerability. "Some things matter more when no one's watching," he said, his voice low. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, just once, and turned to head back to her porch. It wasn't much, a few words, a shared glance. But as the screen door creaked behind her and Jake stood alone again with the returned containers in hand, he couldn't shake the sense that something small but significant had shifted. Almost a conversation. Almost something more. Before she was Catherine Evans, the quiet woman on the porch with the cardigan and soft voice. She had been Catherine Whitmore, known to glossy magazines and business journals as the young lioness of Wall Street. Her face had once graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, her name synonymous with bold moves and bottom lines. She was the kind of woman who negotiated billion-dollar mergers in heels that clicked like punctuation marks and delivered keynote speeches without a single glance at her notes. But success, she'd learned, was a double-edged thing, sharp enough to cut you open when you least expected it. It had all come apart in one summer slowly, then, all at once. A boardroom betrayal, a media frenzy, and the man she thought she'd marry whispering apologies through a locked hotel door as headlines blared about insider whispers and suspicious timing. Catherine hadn't done anything illegal, but that hadn't mattered. She'd become the story, and in her world, perception was more lethal than truth. So she disappeared. Not in the dramatic tabloid Wayno flights to foreign beaches or dark sunglasses behind velvet ropes. She simply sold her Manhattan condo, liquidated what she needed, and bought a house in a town she'd picked off a paper map. A place with no skyscrapers, no flashbulbs, no expectations. Maple Glen, Illinois. Just the name had sounded safe. She arrived without fanfare, hiring a moving company under a different name and sending back every curious, "Where did you go?" message, unread. At first, the quiet was deafening. The stillness inside the big house felt like a punishment. But then, it started to feel like something else. Healing, maybe. Catherine became a silent observer of neighbors walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, leaves gathering in corners like forgotten thoughts. She noticed Jake Wallace on her first afternoon, hammering a crooked plank back onto his fence, Tyler running barefoot across their yard, giggling. Something about them had caught her, something honest. She hadn't planned to watch them, hadn't meant to care. But in a world where everyone she'd known wanted something, there was something different about a man who gave without asking anything in return. It was inconvenient, disarming, and somehow exactly what she needed. The first time Catherine saw Jake, really saw him, it was through her front window, the day she moved in. No one had noticed the black SUV that dropped her off with only a single suitcase and a folded-down ball cap. No one had knocked to ask questions, and that suited her just fine. But he was there, across the yard, hammering a crooked board back onto a worn fence, shirt damp with sweat, his young son darting around him with a toy airplane clutched in one hand. They laughed together, real laughter, the kind that made the air feel lighter. Catherine had paused mid-unpacking, one hand on a box marked "Books," and stood there watching as Jake lifted Tyler high in the air, airplane and all, as if joy was just something you picked up and carried. She didn't know then how often she'd find herself by that same window. In the weeks that followed, Catherine saw more. Jake offering to carry groceries for the elderly woman 2 houses down, no fanfare, no fuss, just a quick smile and a, "Got it, Miss Leona." She saw him crouch beside a shivering golden retriever that had slipped its leash and was trembling near the curb, whispering softly until the dog calmed enough for him to read the tag and walk it home. One night, long after most of the town had gone to bed, she spotted him through the front window again. The light in his kitchen glowed softly as he sat at the table, papers spread in front of him, calculator in hand. He looked exhausted, rubbing at his eyes, the weight of something pressing heavily on his shoulders. She watched him exhale, lean back in his chair, and glance toward the couch where Tyler had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets and stuffed animals. Jake didn't know anyone was watching. That was what struck her the most. Catherine had spent years surrounded by people who smiled for cameras and mirrors but never for each other. People who were only kind when they thought it would serve them. But Jake was kind when no one was looking, especially then. She kept telling herself that what she felt watching him wasn't interest. Not yet, not quite, but it was something. And it grew a little more each time she caught him doing the right thing without needing to be seen. It was the little things that caught Jake's attention first. The trash bins, usually rolled out to the curb every Tuesday like clockwork, sat untouched by the side of Catherine's house. The mailbox, sleek and black with a polished brass handle, had grown so full the lid no longer closed all the way. Flyers curled at the edges from dew and morning chill. A few letters had begun to droop, precariously close to slipping out. Jake didn't like to assume. Maybe she was out of town. Maybe she had friends bringing things in through the back. But deep down, he didn't believe that. Not from someone who'd returned a soup container like it was sacred. Not from someone who didn't seem to let much of anything go unnoticed. By Thursday morning, the worry had settled in. Not loud, not urgent, just that quiet sense that someone might need help and wasn't going to ask for it. So Jake acted the way he always did, quietly, without ceremony. He stopped by the corner market after his morning delivery run and picked up the basics: milk, eggs, bread, and some of that chamomile tea Tyler swore helped with weird feelings. He tossed in a few extras too: apples, oatmeal, and a jar of local honey she'd once mentioned in passing during their short exchange on the porch. Back home, he packed the items carefully into a reusable canvas bag. No note this time, just the groceries, and a folded receipt to show it wasn't charity, just a neighbor doing neighbor things. He walked across the lawn just after lunch. The clouds hung low, and wind teased the corners of his jacket. He didn't knock this time. Didn't wait. Just placed the bag at her front door, adjusted it so the eggs wouldn't tip, and tucked the mailbox shut before heading back. From the window across the street, Catherine watched the entire thing. She didn't open the door right away. Instead, she stood in the shadowed hallway, hand resting lightly on the frame, heart pounding harder than she liked to admit. It wasn't the groceries that shook Harriet, was the instinct, the unspoken noticing. Jake had seen something was wrong, and instead of questioning or pushing, he simply showed up. That was the part that unraveled her the most. The quiet, unwavering way he gave. The invitation came on a Friday afternoon, as unexpected as a sunbeam cutting through storm clouds. Jake had just stepped onto his porch with a crate of herbs when he noticed her. Catherine standing at the edge of her own steps, hands folded in front of her like she was holding something invisible and fragile. Her posture was still guarded, but there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not obligation. Something softer. "Jake," she called, her voice light but clear. He looked up, surprised to hear his name come from her mouth so easily. "Hey," he said, brushing his palms on his jeans. "Everything okay?" She nodded once. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Jake blinked, a heartbeat passing before he answered. "Sure," he said slowly, gently. "I'd like that." Inside, the first thing he noticed was the smell lavender and something faintly citrus, the kind of scent that lingers in expensive candles. The air was quiet, still. No television, no music, just the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock somewhere deeper in the house. Catherine moved ahead of him, graceful but hesitant, like someone relearning how to share space. "You can sit wherever you'd like," she said, gesturing toward a sunlit sitting room just off the foyer. The furniture was classic, understated linen and leather, muted blues and soft creams. It was the kind of room where nothing was out of place, and yet it didn't feel cold. It felt intentional, like someone had built it as a kind of peace offering to herself. He sat on the edge of a high-backed armchair while Catherine disappeared briefly into the kitchen. When she returned, she carried a wooden tray with 2 porcelain cups and a small dish of lemon slices. Everything matched. "This place is beautiful," Jake said, accepting the tea with a nod of thanks. "You've got taste." Catherine gave a small smile. "Too much time spent in boardrooms and hotel lounges. I guess I was craving soft things." Jake met her eyes. "You found them." They sipped in silence for a while. Not awkward silence, but the kind that breathes on its own. And as the warmth from the tea spread through him, Jake couldn't help but think that for the first time he wasn't just dropping something off or checking in. He was being let in. And that, somehow, meant more than all the meals he'd left on her doorstep. The clink of spoons and the quiet shuffle of napkins filled the space between them as dusk painted soft amber across the walls. Catherine had insisted on serving dinner, claiming it was the least she could do after weeks of Jake's doorstep deliveries. She'd made a velvety butternut squash soup, simple, rich, and surprisingly comforting, and paired it with warm, flaky biscuits that steam still curled from. They sat at her dining table, the kind that looked more suited to formal dinners than quiet conversations. Yet somehow, With just the two of them, and the soft glow of candlelight flickering in the middle, it felt right. Jake tore a biscuit in half and glanced at her over the rim of his bowl. "This is really good," he said, meaning it. Catherine smiled. "Old recipe. My mother's, actually. She made it every fall, whether we asked for it or not. Sounds like someone who knew what people needed before they did." Catherine's smile faltered just slightly, her eyes going distant. "Sometimes," she said. But she wasn't great at the quiet stuff. The silence always made her nervous. She'd fill it with noise-talking, movement, anything to keep the stillness away. Jake nodded slowly, spoon resting in his bowl. "I used to do that too, right after my wife passed. Thought if I kept moving, working, fixing things, I wouldn't feel the gap she left behind." There was no judgment in Catherine's face. Only understanding. She looked at him, not through him, not past. He met him. "How long has it been?" she asked gently. 4 years, he said, voice even, though the weight of it still lived in his bones. "Tyler was 4. He doesn't remember much. But I do." Catherine reached for her tea, fingers brushing the edge of the cup. "Grief is funny like that. It settles into the quietest corners, not always loud. Sometimes it's just there." Jake's jaw tightened for a breath. "Yeah, silence can scream if you let it." For a long moment, they didn't speak. The only sounds were the soft tick of the wall clock and the rain beginning to whisper against the windows. Then Catherine broke the quiet with a voice more certain than before. "Thank you for staying tonight." Jake looked at her, warmth rising in his chest despite the chill outside. "Thanks for letting me." The rain had softened into a mist by the time Jake slipped on his jacket and made his way to the front door. Catherine stood near it, hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan, her posture graceful but just a touch uncertain. Something about the way she lingered, not rushing, not retreating, made him pause before reaching for the knob. "Drive safe," she said quietly. Jake glanced at her, then held her gaze for a moment longer than polite conversation required. It wasn't awkward, it was something else, something fuller, something real. "Will do," he replied. "Thanks again for dinner. It was more than a meal." She smiled, but there was a flicker in her expression, like a tremor beneath still water. He'd seen that look before on the faces of customers who came in too tired to eat but too proud to admit they needed help. On himself, in the mirror, after long nights with nothing but bills and old memories to keep him company. "You're not used to this, are you?" he asked softly. Catherine blinked. "Used to what?" "Letting people in." Her breath caught, just slightly, and then, slowly, she shook her head. "No, I guess I'm not." Jake leaned against the doorframe, eyes still on hers. He hadn't noticed it before. Not clearly, not with everything else between them, but her eyes weren't just green, they were alive. Like moss after rain, layered with things unsaid. And under all that intelligence, all that poise, was something more fragile, sadness. It lived in the way she paused before answering, in the way she hesitated to ask questions, in the way she wore her silence like armor. "I don't need to know everything," Jake said, his voice steady. "But for what it's worth, you don't have to carry it all alone." Catherine's gaze dropped to the floor for a heartbeat. When she looked up again, the smile she offered was softer, less rehearsed. "Thank you, Jake." He gave a small nod, then stepped out into the mist. The door closed behind him with a gentle click, but the space between them, whatever it was, remained open, stretched across porches and raindrops and unspoken truths. And for the first time, Jake felt the spark of something stirring where grief used to live. Steam curled upward from the mugs on the kitchen table, carrying the scent of peppermint and honey through the quiet of the room. The windows fogged faintly at the corners, blurring the gray world outside and making the moment feel suspended like time had paused just long enough to let something delicate unfold. Catherine sat across from Jake, one hand wrapped around her mug, the other tracing the edge of a linen napkin folded neatly by her plate. Dinner had come and gone, one of Jake's easy stews. Hearty and humble but, Neither of them had moved much since the last bite. They had talked about little things. Tyler's growing fascination with comic books. The weather turning colder. The sleepy rhythm of the town. Safe things, simple things. But underneath the ease of it, Catherine felt the weight of her secret growing heavier. Jake leaned back in his chair, smiling gently. "You ever think about leaving town? Starting over again somewhere new?" Catherine's fingers stilled. "I already did." "Fair," he said with a chuckle. "Guess I walked into that one." She looked at him then, really, looked at him. His eyes kind, his posture relaxed, his face open in a way that people in her old world rarely allowed themselves to be. He had no idea who she was. No clue what name used to sit above stock tickers or who had once walked red carpets in designer shoes and smiled through interviews like her soul wasn't unraveling behind the scenes. She wanted to tell him. The truth hovered on the back of her tongue, like a confession waiting for absolution. "My name's not Catherine Evans, not really. I've been on magazine covers. I've been lied to, used, photographed, torn apart in the press. I have money more than you could guess, and none of it has ever made me feel as safe as your front porch did last Tuesday." Her heart pounded, and still she said nothing. Instead, she took a slow sip of her tea and offered him a soft, careful smile. "This place has a way of making you want to stay, doesn't it?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, it does." And, just like that, the moment passed like steam rising from a mug and disappearing into the air before anyone could name what it was. The snow started mid-after quiet, almost playful at first. Just a few flurries, dancing across the windshield, as Jake drove Tyler home from school. By the time they turned onto their street, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and flakes were falling thick and fast, blanketing the trees and sidewalks in white. "Whoa." Tyler breathed from the back seat, his nose pressed to the window. "It's like someone shook the whole town into a snow globe." Jake's eyes narrowed on the road ahead. Visibility was dropping fast, and the tires slipped slightly as they pulled into the driveway. "It wasn't even in the forecast," he muttered. "Of course." As they stepped out of the car, snow already clinging to their jackets, Catherine's porch light flicked on across the yard. Jake turned toward the house just as her front door opened a crack. "Jake," she called, voice raised above the growing wind. "You're not planning to drive in this, are you?" He adjusted Tyler's backpack and shielded his son with his arm. "Just got in. I was going to make something quick and wait it out." Catherine hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come over. You shouldn't be alone in this. I made too much stew anyway." Jake looked down at Tyler, who was already grinning. "Please, Dad?" He exhaled, nodded once. "All right, but just for dinner." By the time they crossed the yard, snow had begun piling on their shoulders and boots. Catherine welcomed them in with warm towels and soft lighting, the house smelling faintly of rosemary and fresh bread. A fire crackled gently in the living room, casting golden light across the hardwood floors. Dinner was laughter and seconds, and Tyler asking if she had Wi-Fi so he could show her a cat video on his tablet. It felt easy, right. Outside, the wind howled. "Roads are iced over," Catherine said later, phone in hand. "They're advising no travel until morning." Jake gave a slow nod, glancing at Tyler, who had already nodded off under a knit blanket on the couch. "Well?" he said softly. "Looks like we're staying." Catherine smiled, heart unexpectedly full, as she fetched extra pillows from the linen closet. What started as a meal had become something more, a night of shared space, shared warmth, and maybe the start of something neither of them had dared imagine. Morning came wrapped in quiet, the kind of hush only fresh snow could bring. Outside, the world lay blanketed in white. Rooftops softened, trees frosted like cake, and the roads still hidden beneath layers of ice. Inside Catherine's house, though, warmth had found a foothold. Jake stirred first, waking on the pull-out sofa with the faint scent of coffee teasing the edge of his dreams. A knitted throw had slipped halfway off his chest, and the fire from the night before had dwindled to glowing embers. He sat up slowly, taking in the unfamiliar but oddly comforting space, then looked over, to see Tyler curled like a puppy on the other end of the couch, one sock missing, and his hair sticking up in every direction. The kitchen lights were on. Jake rose, quietly padding across the hall. Catherine stood barefoot at the stove in a soft robe and flannel pajama pants, flipping pancakes with a practiced hand. Her hair was loosely tied, her eyes still a little sleepy, and she looked more like someone he might have known in another life back when mornings were slow and simple. "You're up early?" he murmured. She smiled over her shoulder. "Habit. I figured if we were all snowed in, we might as well start the day with pancakes." "I'm not arguing." Moments later, Tyler wandered in, yawning dramatically and sniffing the air like a cartoon character. "Is that syrup?" Jake ruffled his hair. "Only the real stuff. You lucked out, kid." After breakfast, Catherine brought out a tray of cocoa and offered Tyler a small tour of the living room. That's when he spotted the piano tucked beside the window, a beautiful upright with smooth, dark wood and a quiet dignity. "You play?" he asked, wide-eyed. "I used to," she admitted. "Can I try?" She hesitated, then nodded. Tyler climbed onto the bench and tapped at the keys, letting out a giggle when they chimed back like a greeting. The notes were scattered, clumsy but joyful. Jake sat back, watching his son play, watching Catherine laugh with a kind of lightness he hadn't seen in her before. Music filled the Hausenot, perfect but warm. And as snowflakes drifted outside the window, something else drifted between the three of them. Comfort, connection, the beginning of belonging. By Monday morning, the snow had begun to melt. Dripping steadily from rooftops and turning sidewalks into slushy streams, Jake shoveled the walk with steady motions, clearing a path from Catherine's porch to the street before heading back home with Tyler, both of them warm from the unexpected weekend and a little reluctant to leave it behind. But small towns have sharp eyes and louder mouths. By the time Jake reached Harrison's Market for his regular grocery run, the whispers had already begun. "See him? That's the Wallace boy. Heard he stayed the whole night at the old Whitmore place. Not just him, his kid, too. Must have been some kind of sleepover. Think she's finally come out of hiding?" Jake didn't need to hear the words to feel them. The lingering glances, the half-smiles that didn't reach people's eyes. He'd lived in Maple Glen his whole life long enough to know how fast a story could grow without any help at all. Inside the market, Maggie from the checkout counter gave him a pointed look as she scanned his items. "Big storm," she said, voice light but loaded. "Heard you were stuck over on Hawthorne Street." Jake didn't flinch. "Yeah, road's iced over. Catherine was kind enough to let us stay." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Jake gave her a tired smile, took his bags, and left without another word. Later that afternoon, back in his own kitchen, he sat at the table while Tyler colored beside him. He could still hear Catherine's laugh from the morning, still see the way she'd watched Tyler at the piano with something close to wonder in her eyes. And yet, unease crept in. It wasn't just the gossip. It was the realization that Catherine had let him into her house, into her silence, but he still didn't really know who she was, where she'd come from, why she'd chosen a town like theirs. He trusted her, or at least he wanted to. But in a place where everyone knew everyone, a mystery only stayed charming until it became inconvenient. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was inching closer. The phone rang just after noon, sharp and sudden, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Catherine nearly dropped her teacup. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code made her stomach tighten. Manhattan. She stared at the screen for a second too long before answering, every instinct telling her to let it ring. But her thumb moved anyway. "Hello? Catherine." The voice was smooth, practiced, too familiar. "Took me a while to track down this number. Disconnected lines, no forwarding address. Clever." Her breath caught. "Who is this?" "Oh, come on. It's Henry Blakemore, the Ledger. We did that feature on your rise at Whitmore Investments, remember? You wore that navy dress, said you weren't into flash. That story hit like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know who you were." She closed her eyes. That was a lifetime ago. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice level. Henry's tone turned casual, almost friendly. "Just checking in. I was having coffee with an old contact. Someone mentioned a reclusive woman in a charming town in Illinois. Big house, big gate, not much noise. Sounded familiar. Catherine swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the front window. Snow was melting in rivulets down the glass, and outside, everything still looked ordinary. I'm not giving you a story. I'm not asking for one. Yet. He paused. But people still remember you, Catherine. Disappearances raise eyebrows. And when one of the most promising women in finance vanishes after a scandal, well, eyebrows become questions. Some think you've got something to hide. She gripped the counter until her knuckles blanched. I'm not hiding, she said quietly. I'm healing. Another pause, this one heavier. Fair enough. But be careful, Catherine. Secrets don't stay buried in places like that. Small towns have long memories. The line clicked, and just like that he was gone. Catherine stood still, heart pounding in her throat. She looked around the kitchen, the warm glow, the soft shadows, the ghost of Jake's laughter from 2 nights ago, and felt the walls tighten around her. The peace she'd built, the quiet life she'd grown into, it was all more fragile than she'd dared believe. The past was knocking. And this time, it knew her name. Catherine stood at her bathroom mirror, fingers brushing lightly over the edge of a pearl earring as she stared at her reflection. Her heart beat faster than it should have for something as simple as dinner. Tonight wasn't just another quiet meal. Tonight, she'd tell him. She'd rehearsed it twice over coffee, once aloud in the mirror. My name isn't really Catherine Evans. I used to be someone else, someone the world paid attention to for all the wrong reasons. She had imagined the look on Jake's face, confused at first, maybe disappointed, maybe not, but she owed him the truth. It was past time. When she stepped outside, the wind had picked up, brushing her coat against her legs and rustling the trees. Jake's house glowed warmly from the kitchen, windows fogged slightly, the scent of roasted garlic and thyme drifting through the air as she crossed the yard. He opened the door with that familiar half-smile, Tyler bouncing behind him, already chattering about the super special garlic bread he'd helped make. Inside, the table was set with mismatched plates and a folded paper napkin at each spot, Tyler's handiwork, no doubt. A small vase held a handful of clumsily clipped backyard daisies, and suddenly everything felt fragile. Over dinner, they laughed easily. Tyler told a story about a spelling test gone sideways, and Catherine found herself genuinely smiling, the weight in her chest loosening just enough to breathe. Jake poured her another glass of water and asked, gently, "You okay? You've been quiet tonight." She looked up. His eyes were steady, warm, trusting. This was it. She opened her mouth, the truth perched on the edge of her tongue, but then she glanced at Tyler so carefree, so happy in this little kitchen full of noise and life, and her resolve wavered. Here was a man who'd worked to build peace from the broken pieces of his life, who gave without questioning and listened without pressing. His world was simple, honest, and hers was anything but. So she smiled instead. Just tired. It's been a long week. Jake didn't press. He only nodded, offered her another slice of bread, and kept the conversation light. Catherine took the bread with shaking hands, the confession slipping back into her chest like steam disappearing into cool air. Not tonight. Not yet. Catherine was watering her windowsill herbs when the knock came, 3 quick taps, followed by the unmistakable sound of sneakers skidding across a porch. She dried her hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find Tyler standing there, his cheeks pink from the cold and his hair tousled beneath a too big beanie. "Hey, Miss Catherine," he said, breathless with purpose. "I have something really important to ask you." She stepped out onto the porch, smiling. "Well, if it's really important, I'd better hear it." Tyler pulled a crumpled flyer from his jacket pocket and held it out with both hands like a sacred scroll. "It's my school play, this Friday. I'm going to be a tree. Not just any tree, a talking tree." Catherine took the flyer, unfolding it carefully. Bold, cheerful letters announced the annual Maple Glen Elementary Winter Performance, A Forest of Feelings. Beneath it, a cartoon squirrel and smiling cloud beamed from the corners of the page. I wanted to ask if you'd come, Tyler continued, his voice quieter now. Dad says you're busy sometimes, but I thought maybe you'd want to see it, just for a little bit. Catherine's heart did a strange, unexpected twist. Say yes, her instinct whispered. But fear bloomed quickly behind it. A crowd, a gym full of parents. Lights, eyes. Someone looking too long. What if someone recognized her? A photo snapped, a whisper passed. She'd built her quiet life brick by careful brick. Was she really about to risk it for an elementary school play? Tyler looked up at her, hopeful and completely unaware of the storm behind her eyes. You don't have to if it's weird, he said quickly. I just thought it would be cool. Catherine knelt down to his level, her hands steady even as her thoughts raced. You know what, Tyler? I'd be honored to see you be the best talking tree that school's ever seen. His face lit up like a sunrise. Really? Really. As he bounded down the steps and across the yard, Catherine stood watching him, flyer still in hand. She was terrified. But for the first time in a long time, she was also excited. Maybe this was what trust looked like in its first fragile form, an invitation held out by small hands, and a yes whispered despite the fear. The elementary school gym buzzed with the kind of nervous energy only a room full of children in costumes and parents with video cameras could generate. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, paper programs rustled, and someone in the back kept shushing their overly excited toddler. It was chaos, but the joyful kind, the kind that smelled like popcorn and floor wax and homemade costumes. Jake saved a seat in the third row, turning every now and then to glance toward the entrance. Tyler was backstage with the other kids, peeking out from behind the curtain in his felt and cardboard tree costume, and Jake had promised he'd wave the second the lights dimmed. Catherine slipped in quietly. Dressed simply in a long navy coat and scarf, her hair pulled back beneath a soft wool hat. She kept her head down as she moved toward Jake's row, sliding into the seat beside him just as the principal approached the microphone to welcome everyone. Jake leaned in with a grin. You made it. I wouldn't miss it, she whispered. The lights dimmed, the curtain rose. And for a time, the world narrowed to singing clouds, dancing squirrels, and a shy little boy who delivered his single line. Sometimes trees feel lonely too, with a courage that made Catherine's chest ache with pride. But near the end of the performance, she felt it. A shift in the air. 2 rows behind them, a man's gaze landed on her like a weight. She turned slightly, catching the faintest flicker of recognition on his face, eyebrows lifting, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Richard Langston. It had been years, but she knew that face. A former partner. One of the first to turn his back when the whispers began. She froze, heart lurching. He said nothing, just watched. But his eyes told her he was doing the math. Beside her, Jake clapped as the final bow came and the curtain fell. He glanced at her with a smile, but it faltered as he saw her expression. You all right? Catherine forced a smile. Yes, just a little overwhelmed. Jake nodded slowly, studying her. The hesitation, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the crowd, the tension in her shoulders. He didn't push, not yet, but something inside him shifted. She wasn't just a reclusive neighbor with a quiet heart. There was more. And it was finally starting to show. The moon hung low over Maple Glen, casting a silver sheen across the rooftops and washing the quiet streets in pale light. It was later than either of them had planned to stay out, but after the school play, Tyler had fallen asleep in the back seat of Jake's car, and neither Catherine nor Jake had been quite ready to say goodnight. So they walked, side by side down the familiar sidewalk, their footsteps soft against the pavement, their breath visible in the chilly air. Jake had said nothing on the ride home, hadn't asked about the man from the audience, but Catherine had seen the questions forming in his eyes like clouds rolling in. Now, under the hush of moonlight, she knew the time had come. Jake, she said quietly, halting just before they reached her gate. He turned to face her, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, eyes steady and patient. "I haven't been honest with you," she began. Not in a malicious way, just in a scared way. Jake said nothing. He just waited. "My name isn't really Catherine Evans," she said, voice low. "It's Catherine Whitmore." Recognition flickered across his face, just a flicker, but it was there. She saw it land, and her heart dropped. But she kept going. "I used to run one of the biggest private investment firms on the East Coast. I was in magazines, on talk shows, panels. I was someone people called a rising star. Until I wasn't." She looked up, eyes glistening. "There was a betrayal, a scandal. I wasn't guilty of what they accused me of, but that didn't matter. The media spun it anyway. My face was everywhere, and none of it was real, so I left. I walked away from everything: money, headlines, the noise, because it was the only way I could breathe again." Jake's brow furrowed, not in anger, but in thought. In trying to piece it all together. "You came here to hide," he said quietly. "I came here to heal," she corrected, her voice trembling. "But I never expected you, or Tyler, or this life I've slowly let myself want again." Silence fell between them, deeper than the night. Jake looked at her, not the name, not the past, but her. And slowly he nodded. "Okay." A single word. Steady, solid. And under that moonlight, Catherine exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The next morning arrived, quiet and gray. The sky heavy, with clouds that looked like they might snow but couldn't quite decide. Catherine stood at her window with a cup of tea cooling in her hand, watching the street, waiting for something from next door. But Jake's porch stayed still. No sound of boots on the steps, no rumble of his truck warming up, just silence. The night before had played over in her mind on an endless loop. She'd told him the truth finally, fully, and he'd stood there, calm, listening. He'd said okay. And in that moment, it had felt like a lifeline. But now, the silence had weight to it. Jake was rarely quiet. Even in stillness, he had presence. But now he felt distant, like a door she couldn't knock on anymore. Across the yard, inside his own kitchen, Jake sat at the table, a mug of coffee in front of him gone cold. Tyler was humming quietly as he built something out of Legos on the floor, blissfully unaware of the shift that had taken root. Jake couldn't stop thinking, Catherine Whitmore. He'd heard the name before, seen it in a headline or two back when life had felt even further out of reach. Finance queen, media darling, then the fall, the whispers. It wasn't a scandal that hit close to home until now. He thought of her porch light, the soup. The first time she let him in, eyes soft and unsure. All of it had felt real. So why did it feel so complicated now? He knew she wasn't the kind of person who lied for sport. But still, there was a space between what he thought he knew and what he now understood. And Jake, who lived in a world where things broke clean and got fixed with the right tool, didn't know how to mend something made of secrets. He hadn't meant to pull back. But now, he didn't know how to step forward. Later that day, Catherine left a small plate of ginger cookies on his porch with a note. Still me. Still here. But the plate stayed untouched until the sun had dipped behind the trees, and the silence lingered like frost that just wouldn't melt. Days passed. The snow melted in slow drips, forming tiny rivers along the gutters, and the early signs of spring began to whisper their way into Maple Glen, barely there, but present if you knew where to look. Buds on the dogwood trees, mud in the yard where there used to be snow, warmer breath on colder mornings. But the porch next door stayed empty. No light in the window, no warm glow spilling across the steps, no trays of soup, no handwritten notes tucked beneath foil lids. Just stillness. Jake noticed it more than he wanted to admit. At first, he told himself she needed space. She'd shared a lot. Maybe she was retreating to catch her breath. Maybe she thought he needed distance, too, and maybe he had, for a moment. But now? Now it felt different. He found himself glancing at her house as he walked out to grab the mail, lingering a little longer at the window over the sink, half expecting to see her silhouette behind the curtain. Tyler asked once casually. Mid-sandwich. Hey, why hasn't Miss Catherine come by? Jake didn't have a good answer. She's probably just busy, he said, even though he knew she wasn't the kind of busy that looked like this. It wasn't about the food. Not really. Though he did miss the warmth of it, the way she cooked, like someone who knew how to soften pain with flavor. But it was more than that. He missed the space she filled in his day, the way she listened, carefully. The way her voice slowed when she said something important. The way she looked at Tyler like he wasn't just a kid, but a full person worth knowing. And underneath it all, he missed the possibility she carried with her. The idea that maybe, just maybe, life could start again, even after everything had fallen apart. But now that possibility felt like it was fading. One evening, Jake stood at his own porch railing, arms folded tight against the breeze, and stared across the darkened yard. Still no light. Still no her. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like loss. The morning was unusually bright for early March, the kind of light that made the frost on rooftops look like powdered sugar and coaxed birds into hesitant song. Jake was elbow-deep in biscuit dough at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, eyes distant. His movements were automatic, precise, but his mind wasn't in the room. It hadn't been for days. Tyler sat nearby, swinging his legs at the table, watching his dad with quiet curiosity. Jake hadn't said much all week. No jokes. No music playing while they cooked. No hum under his breath. Just silence filled with sighs and half smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You gonna take those over to Miss Catherine?" Tyler asked finally, nodding toward the rising tray of biscuits. Jake didn't look up. "No, Bud. I think she's taking some time right now." Tyler frowned. "She's sick?" "No," Jake said, softer this time. "Not like that." Tyler fell quiet for a beat, then slipped down from his chair and wandered over to the drawer where they kept the recipe cards, worn, food-stained, edges curled from years of use. He thumbed through them until he found the one he was looking for. Dad's Sunday biscuits, extra flaky. He grabbed a clean piece of paper and began copying it, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. When he was done, he folded the recipe in half, added a note in his uneven print, and carefully tucked it into an envelope. "Miss Catherine, here's Dad's best biscuit recipe. He doesn't say it, but I think he's sad without you." Tyler, without a word, he put on his coat, zipped it up with practiced speed, and slipped out the front door. Jake didn't notice until the door clicked shut behind him. Across the lawn, Tyler climbed the steps to Catherine's porch, his boots thudding softly on the wood. He slipped the envelope between the slats of her doorframe, patted it gently like it was something sacred, and jogged back home, cheeks flushed with pride. Inside, Catherine stood behind the curtain, heart in her throat. She hadn't expected a letter. She definitely hadn't expected that letter. And as she unfolded the paper, biscuit recipe and all, the loneliness that had taken root in her chest cracked, just slightly softened by a child's honesty and the aching truth only someone that small could say so plainly. The kitchen was quiet, save for the gentle tick of the wall clock and the low hum of the oven warming up. Jake sat at the table, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in front of him, Tyler's empty cereal bowl still pushed off to the side. The envelope with the biscuit recipe rested between his hands, folded neatly now, but he'd read it 3 times since Tyler brought it back inside, cheeks glowing and eyes hopeful. "She'll read it," Tyler had said confidently. "She's just scared." Jake had nodded but hadn't spoken. Not yet. Not then. Now, in the stillness, he let himself replay everything. The porch light left on too long. The soup container with the elegant handwriting. The piano morning with cocoa and laughter. Her eyes during Tyler's school, play watchful, tender, afraid. Her voice on the night she told him the truth. "My name isn't Catherine Evans. It's Catherine Whitmore." He hadn't reacted how she'd expected. He knew that. And the guilt gnawed at him. He thought about what had made him pull back. The weight of her secret? The name? Or was it just fear of being pulled into something bigger than his quiet life could hold? But as he sat there, surrounded by all the ordinary things that had once felt like anchor's bills, grocery lists, the faint smell of cinnamon from the cookies he and Tyler baked, last weekend, he realized something. It wasn't her wealth that had scared him. It was the way she'd let him in. Because Jake knew pain. He knew grief. But he also knew kindness when it was real. He knew what it looked like when someone remembered the little things, when they offered space without asking anything in return. Catherine had done all of that. Not as a billionaire, not as a former powerhouse in heels, but as a woman trying to breathe again. And he'd fallen for that. For the gentleness in her voice, the way she looked at Tyler like he was more than a kid. The moments when her eyes told him more than her words ever did. Jake reached for his coat. Some things were worth risking the quiet for. It was time to say something that mattered. Maybe for the first time. Maybe not for the last. The backyard wasn't fancy, just a patch of grass worn soft from Tyler's soccer games, a weathered picnic table, and the faint scent of cedar from the fence Jake had patched up last fall. But tonight, under a canopy of glowing string lights, it looked like something out of a dream. Jake had spent the afternoon quietly preparing. He borrowed folding chairs from the neighbor, scrubbed down the table, and clipped a few sprigs of rosemary and lavender from Catherine's own garden he hoped she'd notice. A single linen runner lay across the table, and in the center sat her favorite wine, the label turned just so. He'd remembered it from that quiet evening when she'd let her guard down and laughed over tea. The food was simple, but made with the same care he put into everything. Roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, baby potatoes tossed in butter, and a salad with pears and walnuts. On the stove inside sat a peach cobbler cooling beneath a dish towel. It was warm, familiar, nothing too much. Just enough. He lit 2 candles as the sun began to dip and checked the time. Then, with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, he walked across the lawn to her house and knocked. Catherine opened the door, surprised to see him standing there in his worn flannel, holding a single card. "No soup this time?" she teased gently, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. "No soup," Jake said, offering the card. "Just dinner, outside, if you're willing." She looked down at the card. On the front was a watercolor sketch of a field under a night sky. Inside, it read in Jake's careful handwriting, "I didn't walk away because of who you are. I hesitated because I was scared of what it meant to finally feel something again. I'm sorry I made you feel alone. If you'll let me, I'd like to fix that starting with dinner." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I'll get my coat," she said. Minutes later, they sat beneath the lights, the sky deepening to navy above them, the clink of silverware and soft hum of wind carrying between them. It wasn't about the food, not really. It was about showing up. About taking the first real step towards something that had been quietly waiting for both of them to be brave. And as Catherine took a sip of wine and smiled across the table, Jake knew she had forgiven him, maybe the way he was finally learning to forgive himself. The last of the candles flickered low, casting soft, swaying shadows across the table as the night settled fully around them. The air had cooled, but neither Catherine nor Jake made a move to leave. The plates were mostly empty, the wine glasses half full, and the peach cobbler sat barely touched between them. They weren't hungry anymore, not for food anyway. Catherine leaned back slightly, arms folded over her lap, her eyes fixed on the string lights above. "You know," she said quietly, "there was a time I thought I'd never let anyone close to me again. Not really." Jake didn't rush her. He just listened, the way he always did. "I wasn't just betrayed by strangers," she went on. "I was betrayed by people I let in, people I trusted with everything. So I started keeping my world small, safer that way, but lonely too." Jake nodded, his voice gentle. "I know something about lonely." She looked at him then, eyes dark and shimmering in the light. "You do," she said. That's what I saw in you, before I even knew your name." There was a pause. A long, quiet space that held more honesty than any words could. Jake broke it softly. "After my wife passed, I thought that part of me, the part that could really love again, was just gone. I focused on Tyler, on surviving. And then you showed up next door with your porch light, and your silence. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was watching you just like you were watching me." Catherine's lips curved, a sad little smile that turned real as he kept talking. "I don't care about the headlines or the money or the name," Jake said. "I care about the woman who made soup when she didn't know how to ask for help, who saw my kid and talked to him like he mattered, who looked at me like maybe I wasn't just the guy fixing everything, but someone worth being seen." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "You are." He reached across the table, palm up. She laid her hand in his, like it belonged there. Love wasn't loud that night. It didn't come in a grand speech or a perfect kiss. It came in the cracks between their words, in the tears they didn't hide, in the hope they let themselves feel again. And somewhere in that quiet backyard, love was finally spoken and heard. Spring arrived slowly, like someone testing the water before stepping in. The trees in Maple Glen began to bloom in shy bursts of color, and the streets, once lined with silence and frost, now hummed with a kind of quiet revival. Catherine watched it all unfold from her porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, sunlight brushing across the tops of her knees. She had always been good at investing. She could spot potential in numbers, in people, in ideas, before they even knew what they were capable of. But this was different. For the first time, she wasn't looking for profit. She was looking for purpose. Jake's catering business had always run on grit and reputation. He didn't advertise, didn't ask for help. But she'd seen the long nights, the balancing of bills and recipes, the way he gave more than he ever took. And she just knew what it could become, with a little wind at its back. So she started small, a quiet call to the bank, an anonymous donation to cover the lease on a larger prep kitchen he'd been eyeing for years, a conversation with the mayor about funding new tables for the town square, a grant under an old foundation name for the school's music program, after seeing Tyler's face light up at his first piano recital. Jake didn't ask where the help came from at first. But when the new ovens arrived, when the permits cleared faster than expected, when the invoices showed zero balance due, he looked at her with narrowed eyes and a crooked smile. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this sudden stroke of luck, would you?" Catherine just sipped her tea and shrugged. "Maybe someone thought the town could use a little faith." "Someone?" he repeated, amused. She grinned. "Don't look at me. I'm just a neighbor." But he knew. Of course he did. And when he leaned over and kissed her on the forehead later that night, he didn't say thank you. He just held her hand a little tighter, like he finally understood she wasn't going anywhere. Catherine Whitmore had spent a lifetime building empires. But here, in this town, with this man and his son, and the stories tucked into every corner of Maple Glen, she was building something far more valuable. She was building home. The sign went up on a sunny Saturday morning, hand-carved wood, with soft gold lettering that caught the light just right. Kindred Kitchen. Below it, in smaller script, a simple phrase, home-cooked meals. Second chances served daily. Jake stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed over his chest, staring up at it like he still couldn't quite believe it was real. Beside him, Tyler bounced on his toes, already wearing an apron 2 sizes too big, and a grin that didn't quit. Catherine was a few steps behind them, sunglasses perched on her head, coffee in hand, watching the moment unfold with quiet pride. She hadn't pushed for her name to be on anything. In fact, she'd insisted it not be. This wasn't about her money. It was about Jake's heart and what happened when someone finally saw it for what it was, strong, generous, and full of life. The inside of the cafe felt like Jake's kitchen had been stretched into something bigger but no less warm. There were open shelves with glass jars of herbs and flour, framed photos of the town's old main street, soft jazz floating from hidden speakers, And on each table, a handwritten quote or recipe card, most of them from Jake's old recipe box, now laminated and shared like small, edible pieces of memory. People came. They came with curiosity first. Maple Glen hadn't seen a new business in a long time, but they stayed for the biscuits, the pot pie, the cinnamon bread pudding that Tyler insisted was better than magic. Jake shook hands. He hugged people. He sent food out with smiles and barely had a moment to breathe between orders. But through it all, his eyes found Catherine's again and again. At the counter, in the corner booth, by the window with sunlight catching in her hair. She didn't need to say anything. She'd already said it by believing in him. And as the bell above the door jingled, and the laughter grew, and someone at the back called out, "This feels like home," Jake wiped his hands on his apron, looked around at the packed tables, and finally let himself feel it fully. Not just the success, but the belonging. Kindred Kitchen wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to start again. And every story on those plates began with love. The table was set for 3. No fanfare, no centerpiece, just linen napkins folded into soft triangles, chipped ceramic plates that didn't match, and the comforting scent of roasted chicken drifting through the air. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the evening breeze, carrying with it the soft chirp of crickets and the distant laughter of kids playing one street over. Catherine moved through the kitchen with ease, barefoot, humming under her breath as she carried the last dish to the table, mashed sweet potatoes with brown butter and sage, Tyler's favorite. He'd requested it 2 days ago, and she'd written it down like it was gospel. Not because it was complicated, but because he'd asked, and that still meant something sacred. Jake stepped through the back door, wiping his hands on a towel, cheeks still pink from grilling outside. "Smells incredible in here," he said, walking over to kiss her cheek, like it was the most natural thing in the world, because now it was. Tyler barreled in a second later, hair wild, and arms full of hand-drawn place cards he'd made. One with Dad, one with Miss C, and one that simply said, "Me." They sat together as the sky turned orange and gold beyond the windows. The meal was simple, but every bite tasted like something earned, something shared. They talked about Tyler's school project, about a new dish Jake was testing for the cafe, and about Catherine's slowly growing involvement with the Town Quiet donations, a mentoring group for young girls starting their own businesses, a literacy grant for the library. Not for attention. Just because it felt good to give again, in ways that mattered. No one brought up the past. Not because it didn't exist, but because it no longer owned them. After dinner, they cleared the table together. Tyler rinsed dishes while Jake dried, and Catherine stood at the sink, looking out at the soft flicker of lights strung across the yard. It struck her then, the fullness in her chest, the ease in her limbs, the absence of fear. Not a single secret between them now. No more hiding, no more running. Just Sundays, just warmth. Just a family, stitched together, not by blood or obligation, but by choice. By love.